Yes, for those of you who've not attended one of our formal meetings before, we do open them with a gavel. But the reason we do that, and when we pause them, should we need to pause for any reason, is because it's webcast, and banging the gavel starts the webcast. So, good morning and welcome to City Hall, and welcome to the chamber in City Hall. And I'd like to welcome Assembly members, our invited guests, thank you very much for coming, and members of the public who are here in the chamber today, and also anyone who is watching on the webcast, which I know some people were planning to do because they couldn't actually get along to City Hall today. This is the January meeting of the London Assembly Environment Committee, and we are going to be focusing on climate change and extreme weather. I just put my own mobile device onto silent, so however fascinating your ringtone is, we don't want to hear it for the next couple of hours. So if you could just remember to put your phone, if you're expecting a really important call, put it on to vibrate. Otherwise, if you can put it on to silent, that would be really welcome. We're not expecting a fire alarm today, so if it goes off, it's for real. Please follow directions from the members of staff who know the escape routes out to the muster point outside. We have a few formal items of committee business to go through before we get to our main discussion on climate change and extreme weather. And this is in the context, of course, last December 2018, not December 2019, the Assembly as a whole declared a climate emergency, and a number of boroughs around London have followed us, and obviously also around the country and around the world. And so today's discussion is in that context. But however, before we get on to that, I do need to do these small items of business. In terms of asking for apologies, we do have an apology, which is why I'm chairing the meeting. You can probably see from my nameplate that I'm Leonie Cooper and I'm not Caroline Russell. I'm the Deputy Chair of the committee. Caroline cannot be with us today, which she's actually very upset about and will be following on the webcast. She's unfortunately been taken ill. So it's a great shame that she can't be with us. However, it does mean that she might join in via Twitter and send in some questions herself. So she's been absolutely instrumental in making this meeting happen and ensuring that we have our guests who are with us today. Declarations of interest, which are found on pages 1 to 4 of the agenda pack for the Assembly members. Can I ask the members of the committee to note the list of offices set out at item 2 of the agenda, and as well as noting those, do you have anything else to declare?
Noted.
No? Okay, thank you. The minutes of the October meeting, which is that long ago because we had to stop meeting because of the pre-election period, which was held on the 10th of October, could I ask the committee to agree those minutes from October? Thank you. We also have the summary list of actions, which are closed, completed and outstanding, which is found on pages 49 to 80 of the agenda pack. Can I ask the committee to note those actions? Noted. Thank you. And there's also been some action taken under delegated authority by Caroline Russell, the Chair, which is to be found on pages 81 to 90. There, in consultation with party group leads, there were 2 outputs arising from the meetings held on the 22nd of May and 27th of June. And could I ask the committee to note those actions? Noted. Noted, thank you. Which brings us on to item 6 on the agenda, which is the climate emergency and extreme weather item. And so thank you all very much for coming along. This is actually the first of 2 meetings, so if by any chance you don't get to say everything that you want to say today, you can either send it to us subsequently, but there will be a second meeting which will also be focusing on the climate emergency. Today we're going to be focusing on how London can build resilience both to flooding and also to drought and heat waves. And obviously both of those are very difficult subjects to approach, in the sense that we do need to explore them in detail, but at the same time we don't want to start a huge social panic. So this is something that I hope that we can get into in some detail today, because preparation is essential. Our meeting in February is going to be looking at carbon emissions from the buildings that we live and work in. If you are watching on the webcast, if you use the hashtag Environment Committee or at London Assembly, if you tweet at London Assembly, we'll pick that up. And obviously, I'm hoping that Caroline is going to be joining in because she can't be with us today. As a global city, London has to be one of those cities leading the way in its response to the climate emergency. We were one of the first cities around the world to declare a climate emergency, recognising the risks that we face, and today we are going to be discussing how we can become more resilient to the effects of climate change. With temperatures rising across the world, extreme weather events are already becoming more common and will continue to do so, and are threatening our city and our citizens. London is particularly vulnerable to flooding from extreme rainfall and prolonged. It's also can suffer easily from prolonged heat waves with the urban heat island effect. As Londoners will no doubt remember, our last few summers have been unpleasantly hot. The tube particularly has reached some very high temperatures. Buses and even walking has been difficult for many people. In fact, the last 2 summers have been in the top 5 hottest ever on record. For most of us, the summer heat waves became a daily struggle, but for some Londoners, they had a really serious impact on their health. This is our new reality, and our city, as it's currently constructed, has not been built to withstand such hot weather for us. And overwhelm our Victorian drainage system and affect our transport system. Plus, of course, we have spent a lot of time building concrete over the ground. The worst flood industry experts, community members to help us understand London's current vulnerabilities to extreme weather. They're on the chamber floor. You're all very welcome. I'm not going to introduce you all individually because that would take up too much time. Once we've had a couple of opening presentations for each section of the meeting, I'm going to look for indications from people on the floor from those who would like to contribute. So if you could just wave and let me know that you'd like to come in. We were also going to open the discussion to people who are in the gallery, so you're particularly welcome, those of you who have attended today. So if you've got any questions you'd like to ask, please indicate to Aoife, who is in the gallery somewhere and is now waving to you. She's just up there, over there waving. Aoife has a microphone and she'll come and find you with the microphone so that everyone will be able to hear you. Don't try and speak from the gallery without the microphone because we probably won't be able to hear you. And also, it will not be recorded in the webcast if you speak without the microphone. So even if you project better than anyone else of your acquaintance, please wait for the microphone. We've all got the microphones here. Hopefully you will be able to hear all of the guests on the floor. We will, and it's much better for us because then it gets recorded into the webcast. We're going to start with 2 5-minute presentations. Alex Nixon, who is from Thames Water, is going to talk about long-term planning for water resources, and Bevan Jones, who's over here, who's a climate and sustainability consultant, will discuss the need for adaptation, resilience and climate risk to be taken as seriously as carbon mitigation, which obviously we do spend a lot of time talking about. So I'm going to start with Bevan. Who's already in possession of a microphone. How organised are we?
Hear me?
As near to your face as possible.
Can you hear me with that? Yeah, okay. Thanks, Chair. So I'm going to talk about heat in relation to climate risk and what the Mayor needs to do. A fairly recent study by an NGO called Climate Tracker projected that even if we do meet our Paris targets and all government policies around the world fall into line, we are still going to experience a temperature increase globally of between 3.1 and 3.5 degrees C. So we will still experience a level of climate change. Where the mitigation comes into that is we still need to mitigate to stop us getting up to a 4 to 6 degree world, which would be monumentally catastrophic. Heat is generally undervalued as a risk by organisations, by investors, by the public, and heat should now be considered alongside extreme storminess and snowfall as an event which needs to be treated in the same way. Many organisations don't know how to deal with heat, either in their strategic planning or their delivery, whereas they are now getting to grips with managing carbon, putting a price on carbon. The managing director of Scottish Rail recently said that the rail system is woefully underprepared to deal with the effects of climate change, and that is now. And I think many in the rail industry are aware of that. One of the issues we're also facing is shorter return periods between events, and by that I mean the time taken between what we term as extreme events. 2019 is a great example where we saw lots of really warm days. 2018, 2019, we saw hot days in February, April, we saw the heat wave, and this is now what we're starting to see, those shorter return periods and increased intensity. Just some quick stats. Since 2015, nationally, there have been 3,400 excess summer deaths. In 2019, London was statistically significant in the number of deaths from the heat wave, which the number is 41. That doesn't sound like a lot, but London was the only region in the UK to be statistically significant. We've seen in recent reports that violent crime goes up by 14% during over the course of 2010 to 2018, when the temperature is over 20 degrees. We also see for every 1 degree increase in temperature over 20 degrees, we see an equivalent 1% increase in ambulance call-outs. So with an NHS that's already overstretched, that normally uses the period between April and September to use as its recovery period, we're now seeing the NHS having to deal with a year-round A&E emergency. And that's partly because people generally don't know how to deal with excess heat. The GDP risk to London is around 35 million from heat waves. That's from a Lloyd's of London report. London is second only to Paris in that respect, which takes me on to the solutions. What we are going to have to see is more Paris-style emergency management, where schools will be closed, where people are encouraged not to commute to work, and where we are going to have to start treating heat like we do snowfall or storminess. And I think employers and employees are going to have to change their mindset around that keep calm and carry on. It's going to have to be much more managed, much more rational in that respect. Data collection analysis needs to improve across the public, private and third sector around this. What I find with a lot of my clients is that they can give me energy data, they can't necessarily extrapolate and understand their insurance claim data from extreme weather events and the damage that's been caused to their assets as a result. More research is needed and needs to be updated because from the report that I wrote for the Green Party last year, a lot of the data that I was looking at, some of it was 10 years old. Now that needs to be updated. It needs to be updated within the context of the economy and where we are as a regional economy at the minute. Lastly, adaptation funding must be on a par with mitigation funding. And that goes back to my first point. We are still going to experience a higher level of temperature increase than we've already experienced. So London from the 60s has experienced a mean temperature increase of 1.9 degrees. Now, if we get up to global temperatures of 3.1, London will suffer as a result. So we need to now start funding adaptation properly because at the minute it's seen as either giving up or the poor relation to climate mitigation. That's it.
Well, thanks very much for starting us off, Bevan. That's really helpful. Just before we move on to Alex, if anybody here wants, rather than grabbing the microphone, to put up a question on Slido, you can see we've got these blue screens around the room, which hopefully you can see. You can put questions if you join at slido.com. And then follow the guidance as to get there. It's on the web, so if you want to put your question up via the screens, we can see them here, you can also see them as well. And you can also go onto Slido and you can like other questions that someone else has already submitted. Some of the questions that are up there now, because people knew we were holding the session today, they've sent them in already. So we've already had some submitted. So you can see the top one there, which I can see, the one right at the bottom, I can only see the word HS2 in it, but I can guess what that's probably about, because people's heads are in the way for me. But the top one says, build green corridors, but mostly keep the ones we have. Community gardens are being closed to for the profit of new developers. Why? And we can also highlight them when we're asking these questions. So if you particularly like that question, in fact, that one looks as though it's already got 3 thumbs up, which is why it's at the top. So that will then bring the questions up to the top if you go in there and like them. Or you can add your own questions, okay, just to explain how Slido works. And hopefully that has now given Alex the time to be completely prepared as well, and we'll move on for his presentation as well.
Thank you, Chair. So I was asked to speak quickly on 3 key questions. The first question being, what factors exacerbate the risks of droughts? So the word I've pinned on this one is risk. So risk is both the probability of droughts happening, but also the consequence of their impacts. Now, there are a long list of factors that will increase the risk. I'm going to stick to 5 given the time. Climate change, population growth, customer behaviour, ageing assets, and population vulnerability. So climate change, we are all aware that climate change is expected to drive an increase in the warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers, and more frequent and intense extreme weather. Okay? The impact of that is basically, at its simplest, there will be less rain when we need it. So in the warm, dry summers, there will be less rain when we actually need it most. But we will also expect to experience more frequent and intense droughts, either driven by longer droughts in the summertime, but also potentially driven by a number of successive dry winters. It is the winter rainfall that recharges the base flows that then provide the groundwater and the river flows that we abstract our water from for the rest of the year. So dry winters are almost as bad as dry summers, if not worse. So that means that there is just less water available than we need it. It also means that we have a more sensitive environment. So taking water out of that already drying environment has a greater environmental impact to the environment. It also means we face more challenging production. So warmer summers drive more algal blooms in our reservoirs, and we then need to remove that algae in order to treat the water. That algae can clog up our water treatment processes, so we need to plan to remove those, and the phasing and timing and duration of those algal blooms changes as the climate changes. We will also expect to see more subsidence. So as the London clay dries out in the hotter, drier summers, that means our pipes move around more, and our pipes don't like being moved, and therefore that is likely to drive more leakage. The second factor, population growth, simply more people are going to equal more demand. So we need to plan to supply that growing population, but to encourage that population to be more efficient, so the declining availability of water goes further. It is noted that actually the highest growth nationally is in the driest areas of the country. So we need to plan for that too. Third point, customer behaviour. Now, we all use, I think all of us probably use more water than we really, really need to. I salute those of you who are super water efficient, but basically if we have an increasing demand from the public for water, then we are going to have to find that more water, reuse it or whatever, but we will also, if there is not that water available, have to impose water restrictions. So starting off with hosepipe bans, potentially taking more serious action if the drought persists. Ageing assets was my fourth point. A large proportion of our assets were designed and built for a very different climate. You know, many of them are over 100 years old, so they were designed and built for a different climate and a different size population. Now, the Victorians did a magnificent job and would probably be considered to have over-engineered what we would consider today to be sustainable. But, you know, we're able to, with love and care, to keep these assets going for another 100 years. But we need to be very diligent about how we renew and replace and maintain our assets, and do it in such a way that they are resilient to the future challenges that we will face, of which climate change and population growth are just a couple. The last point is vulnerability. You know, as a society, I would argue we're potentially becoming more vulnerable. We have an aging society, more elderly people. We have greater expectations of just in time. Everything has to work now, has to be fixed right now, and that has created a greater dependency. We also have less resilience. You know, at one point in time, people used to have a header tank in their loft. which meant if the water supply went down in the main outside them, they had several hours supply from that water tank. That water tank is now a bedroom or a loft conversion, and therefore we've increased demand upon our networks. And lastly, greater interdependencies between utilities. So an interruption in some other utility will very quickly impact on our utility, and then our customers face the impact of both of those. The second question I was asked to focus on was what long-term planning are we doing on drought resilience? And there are 4 key areas here. The main one is water resource planning, drought planning, inputting into national development of national policy, and development and wastewater management planning. So covering those quickly, water resources planning, I would argue, is in a very good place. Okay, I think we have the most sophisticated and long-term planning for water than for any other utility. Okay, there's now there's a hierarchy of national framework setting out what are the national priorities. This national framework we expect to be launched sometime this month, and that is likely to say that we will need to increase our resilience to drought to a 1 in 500 year standard. We're currently at a 1 in 100, and through our water resource management plan to deliver a 1 in 200, but the national framework is expected to say that actually drought is such an important issue we need to go even further. The national framework sets out the national priorities, but also looks at the availability of water across the country nationally, and says actually, is there a logic to sharing water, not necessarily through a national grid, as in an energy grid, but cascading water between water companies, so we can move water from where there is more plentiful to where there is less of it. And this framework should enable at the regional plans to then start to consider how they fit together. So at regional level, we are now looking at resilience planning. So not just talking about balancing supply and demand, but actually the resilience of our water supplies to more than just the public water demand. So we consider agricultural need, economic development need, businesses, etc. And those regional plans, so the Southeast plan, then informs the company level plans. So we have a sequence of plans that look out at least 50 years, many of them to 100 years' time. So we are taking a long-term view of all the different drivers that affect the availability of water. On drought planning, every water company has to have a drought plan. It must say what they will do in times of drought for the next 5 years, and has to say how the actions they will increasingly take as availability of water declines. We are looking at working regionally to have a regional drought plan, because clearly what happens in London will affect 4 companies, and we need to make sure that our actions support each other and are mutually supportive, rather than we are robbing Peter to pay Paul. There is a strong development of national policy, so we've got the Environment Bill and we've got the future housing standards, so we're inputting into that, but we really need water to be seen for the important resource that it is, and not something that can just be managed away. And lastly, drainage and wastewater management plans. These are plans to look at drainage and wastewater over a minimum of 25 years. The point is that we are increasingly looking at non-potable water reuse. So how do we use water that would otherwise go into the drain to support non-potable uses? So things like washing, irrigation, etc. So we're not using potable water for non-potable uses. My final question was asked was, is there anything more that the Mayor/GLA can or should do? I think we're very lucky in London that we actually have leading edge planning policy. And so my number one request was that, yes, the Mayor needs to keep driving that frontier, pushing water efficiency, non-potable water use, etc. policy. So we're constantly at the leading edge, because, you know, as we've just heard from Bevan, you know, we are at the sharpest edge of this problem. The second one is to drive implementation of that policy into delivery. It's all very good having the leading policies, but if they're not having teeth and being turned into water efficient developments, then they're not having the benefit we really need them to. The third point is to help us renew our water infrastructure. We have a big plan and big challenge ahead to maintain and modernise London's water infrastructure. We need the GLA support on it, and things like the infrastructure supporting groups are really helpful in us doing that. My fourth point would be around drought planning. So we have a London drought framework that sets out the actions that London can take during a drought, driven by the London Resilience Partnership. However, many of the partners in that aren't as water efficient as they can be. So one of the stages in it is to encourage businesses to become more water efficient. But when we dug under the surface of that, we found that many businesses don't know how much water they use. You know, they don't get the water bill. It goes to a management company and they're then paid through a different section. So we need businesses to own their water bills and to own that water efficiency and to drive it. My fifth point would be we need the Mayor to vote and the Assembly to vocally support metering. Without metering, we can't encourage water efficiency. We can't effectively determine where our leaks are. Water metering is the fairest way to pay for water, and we need that to be driven vocally from the top. We also need help in identifying who are the vulnerable families. Where are the vulnerable families and individuals who need the most support rather than just the support we give to our average customers. So anything the Mayor can do to help us get those individuals and families onto our priority services register, so at times of a burst water main, a flood, a drought, we can actually target them and give them the help that they need in whatever the form they need it. And lastly, it is just to promote the intrinsic value of water. We only talk about water when there is too much and too little. We do not value it for the incredible, wonderful resource that it is, and because of that, it is not in our consciousness, and therefore we face a constant uphill battle to improve the way we manage it. Thank you.
Very good.
So we've had two contrasting introductory statements, but very complementary, I think. And I am now going to try and see who wants to stick up their hand and join in the discussion. It's going to be slightly difficult for me. If Caroline was here as well, we normally, if you've got the chair and the deputy chair, you can point out if you've just missed somebody. So I'm going to try and make sure I see the assembly members who are just here. I'm going to try and make sure I see anyone in the audience who wants to stick up their hand, but I'm also particularly going to see if anybody on the floor now wants to come in. And I've immediately seen Sarah has put up her hand, so that's very easy, because I think, Bevan, have you still got the microphone? No, but shall we start with, we'll start with Sarah Green. I've actually got a list of the names of the people on in the floor, which is why I can say who they are when they're microphone, and then after that I'm going to bring in Jeanette. But just before we start with you, can I just welcome, we normally welcome schools who come along. Mulberry School for Girls from Tower Hamlets are here today. Can you give us a wave?
Ooh.
Hello, thanks very much for joining us. And water is a very important issue in Tower Hamlets. I've spent some time discussing water in the large mosque in Tower Hamlets myself. Sarah.
Hello, thank you very much for this opportunity. I am from the northwest of London, Hillingdon, and the reason I'm here, I've been campaigning very, very hard for the last few years to protect the aquifers in that area of London. This is pure drinking water that comes straight from the aquifer that is abstracted by affinity water, not Thames water. And we have very good quality water in the west of London because it is ancient water that is filtered over a very, very long time through the chalk. Now, we are in real problems in the west of London, and we need the attention of the rest of London because HS2 infrastructure is building right through 3 inner source protection zones. Now, an inner source protection zone is a 50-day travel time to a source. So it's straight through the middle of 3 sources. 2 of those sources provide water, drinking water of really high quality. The only thing affinity water has to do is to add chlorine. And I think sometimes they add too much. But it's pure water. It's not recycled like Thames water. It doesn't have a whole load of hormones and other things in. It is the drinking water that really all people in the future need to have access to. Now, these resources are totally under threat. The first source is the Ickenham source. Here, HS2 want to build through the source. They've already taken down 3,000 trees, which has altered the ability of that source to purify itself. They want to build a great big cutting. It's called the Copthall cutting, and it's much wider than it needs to be because they've got passive provision for the Heathrow spur. Everything about this project is wrong. The water in that source is already too contaminated for human consumption. This is because in the past, London buried its waste. There is a huge landfill site called the New Year's Green landfill site. It's a special site of contamination. It is contaminating the water in that source, a huge amount of water, which could be used for human consumption. That landfill site has not been dealt with. We want money for the mitigation for that landfill site. Then the pollution will stop going into the water source there, and one day we maybe could use it again. But to do that, we have to stop HS2. The next two sources are where water is drawn for the whole of the central region of Affinity Water. That's 3.2 million people's water. They are now planning to pile drive on a gentle curve which increases all the stresses and strains, 70 metres into that chalk, hundreds of piles across 5 lakes. They want to move 3 rivers. Nothing about this project has been thought out in ecological terms. Now, Affinity Water, who put into the government how bad this plan was in 2013, they have taken a financial indemnity, which means they're financially covered if any losses happen to that aquifer. This is not in the interests of the people. This is not in the interests of London. Affinity Water in September 2019 have put in a request to the Environment Agency, and I want the Environment Agency to stand up. The Environment Agency have not passed this yet, but the Affinity Water want to stop using the water from the Blackford sources across the Mid-Colne Valley until April 2025. And they want to take extra water in bulk transfers from Thames. They want to build additional treatment plants because they know the water will be different quality afterwards. And they want to abstract more water from further up the valley at Watford. None of these plans have been thought through. The long-term effect, we do not know whether those sources, like the source at Ickenham, can ever come back on stream. We are poisoning our most precious resource. And the one thing I did agree with the Thames Water man was that we underestimate the value of water. Water is life.
So, I'd actually quite like to, Sarah, if you don't mind, I know you said I'd like to put those points to the Environment Agency, but I wonder if I could ask Alex to comment on some of the points that you were making about the way that we approach aquifers, because what you're actually talking about is not so much to do with the impact of climate change on our water supply, but certainly the impact of humanity on our water supply, in this case because we want to build a big railway. So I wonder if you could comment on these issues about how the aquifer, and also Sarah made a glancing reference to the fact that Thames Water only reuses water, and I wonder if Thames Water uses aquifers as well. I know it's difficult because I know it's not actually your direct area, but I know you do, and I know Ofwat is also trying to get the water companies to work more closely together. Is it generally a good idea for us to mess around with aquifers, if I can just put it in a very short sentence, in the way that Sarah has just described?
So 70% of London's water from Thames Water comes from the Thames. Only 30% comes from aquifers. So that water, it was characterised by Sarah as reuse because obviously the Thames has flowed through many other water companies and water has been abstracted, consumed, removed, treated, put back into the environment several times over on its way down the Thames. So you could argue that yes, it has been reused. Much of it, so we tend to take it out in the winter, store it in reservoirs, treat it. So there is the reuse is loose. Now, as I understand it, most water aquifers are protected by source protection zones that tries to protect those areas from development. And, I think that we would be, we very jealously guard our source protection zones. However, we do need to balance the need for different types of infrastructure. So I'm afraid I'm not close enough to the HS2 case to be able to knowledgeably comment on that. However, the government has brought together something called RAPID, which is supposed to be looking at how you drive new water resource development together, but it is supposed to be considering other infrastructure types. So to understand the demands between delivery of different infrastructures. I'm afraid that's what I can comment on at the moment.
Would you like to come in and say something, Charlie, as well on this? I don't know whether you're close enough as well to comment on exactly where we are. This is Charlie Wood, who's from the Environment Agency.
Hi So I don't work specifically with the HS2 team, so I'd have to take those points away to answer those fully, but I'm happy to have a conversation with you afterwards to take those. But we are working with Ofwat on the RAPID programme that Alex Nixon mentioned there, that's bringing forward other water resource options. So maybe if we take that offline and I can take that back to the team.
And I think what we could, I'm sure if Caroline was here, that she would want us to say that perhaps that the committee could write to Grant Shapps and make some of these points, because there is a review of the HS2 project being conducted at the moment, just to check that all of these are being taken into consideration, and perhaps also to write to Affinity Water and pose the questions as well. If the committee are minded that we should do that. I can see nodding, if that's acceptable.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I think we could go further.
Thank
Couldn't
you.
we bring some of the relevant players together and see if we can both have a scrutiny and get something positive coming out of it as well?
Before we write.
Okay, so I think we've got some actions that we can see how we can develop that. Thank you, Sarah. That's a good question, a good set of points, in fact, actually, to have started with. I think the next person who indicated that they wanted to come in was Jeanette. And can I just take another... Is there anyone else who wants... So I can see Jacob as well then. Okay, Jeanette first.
Chair, thank you. Can I just say, huge fan of Mulberry Girls. Nice to see you here. And I just want to pick up, and Sarah said it, water is life. And Alex said it, and Alex reminded us how blasé we are about water and only think about it in passing. And certainly coming from nursing, you're fully aware of water, and if you have a chronic condition, you're aware of the importance of water in your body. So I think there's an educational piece that is absolutely necessary, so that as we walk about our city, I think in the same way that we're informed about pollution now, just like a reminder, 60% of an adult body is water, and the brain is 73% of water, the lungs are 83%, skin is 64%, muscles and kidney is 79%, and even the bones are watery at 31%. So, it is so essential to us. And so then it brings me on to the question to Alex, and absolutely agree with everything you've said, but the missing piece for me is how regions, city regions and the regions of the UK are working together. I'm mindful that I grew up in Birmingham, so we didn't have enough water, so we went and bought it from Wales. When I was a child, we grew up knowing that our water was bought from Wales. And as you travel around the country, Wales, Scotland, you see so much water. You come back thinking water, water. So isn't there a missing piece about us nationally sitting down and saying that there are water-rich areas and that we've got to get to grips with that and understand that, certainly before we go to a national meter scheme, in my view. What are your thoughts?
I think his thought is that he'd like the microphone.
Thank you, Jeanette. So I referred to a national framework and the regional water resources group. So the national framework is basically sort of saying, yes, clearly it is a wetter north and a drier southeast, and is there opportunities to move water around, and also what are the key principles and standards that we should be developing to?
Yes.
I would challenge you that the north and the west is always wetter. So some of the northern water companies have actually had to extend their drought permits 6 times.
Right.
So there actually isn't the availability of water necessarily when we would also need it.
Right.
So I think we've got to be cautious about there being a persistently wet north that can always bail out a dry south.
Yes.
And that's part of what the national framework is going to identify.
Yeah.
What the regional plans do is they say, actually, rather than each water company developing the plan that suits itself best, is there actually strategic solutions that might benefit several water companies? Independently, they might not pursue, but collectively make a more sustainable and better sense. So the regional planning, and we've been inputting our bits into the water resources in the southeast, is to identify the strategic options and say, actually, when several companies work together, and there are 6 water companies in water resources in the southeast, what are the solutions that are best for all of them, rather than what is the best solution for each of them? And this framework is what I'd say that I felt that water resource planning was in a good place, because actually we were starting to take a proper strategic, proper long-term look across companies and across water demand. So not just public water supply, but agriculture, business, etc.
Thank you very much.
Just before I bring Jacob in, we've also got a question up on the Slido at the top, which I'd also like to put to you, Alex, as well, which follows up really from the point that Jeanette was making about the availability of water before you start considering metering. And I think it speaks to the point that you were making about we need to reuse non-potable water more effectively. And the point that's being made there is, why are we doing the super sewer project, the Thames Tideway Tunnel, and allowing the rainwater to still be treated effectively going into the Thames Tideway Tunnel and then being treated along with the sewage as something that needs to be in the tunnel? Shouldn't we be capturing it more effectively? And you were talking yourself about using non-potable water more efficiently, and this question is saying the same. Shouldn't we be capturing it, storing it, and using it? And shouldn't we be looking to that first before we move on to the idea of metering? So it's the same, isn't there more that we can be doing?
So I agree. I mean, the point of the Thames Tideway Tunnel is to stop the Thames being used as a toilet. To stop us dumping dilute but untreated sewage into the Thames. And I don't think the presence of the tunnel precludes us being able to do more on non-potable, because actually your non-potable bit is about taking the rain and grey water at a building level or at a community level and treating it for non-potable purposes. So yes, there is more we can be doing. I still maintain that if you don't know how much water you're using, you don't value it, and therefore you're not going to be efficient about it. And that's why I think metering is up there. Water efficiency has got to come before we build new stuff. But the time it takes us to build new stuff and the time it takes for deep-reaching water efficiency to reach everywhere means we need to run both plans in parallel.
Okay, so you're saying we need to do both. I'm going to bring in Nikki, and then I'm definitely coming to Jacob, and then I'm going to take Barry Todman. Yeah? Okay,
just on the non-potable water, do you think it's essential now, with all the building work we're doing, that in new developments we actually have dual water systems, so that we don't just supply potable and also non-potable water?
Yes.
And what is Thames Water doing about that? Because we've argued, the Assembly has argued for dual systems since 2004.
We would very much like to see at least dual plumbing put in now, because retrofitting that is incredibly expensive. I would say at an individual building level, the business case for rain and grey water harvesting still needs to be made, but at a community scale, it works and it is already happening. It just tends to happen at the sort of the eco-bling end of development and hasn't been mainstreamed. So I believe that we are working with the GLA Water Advisory Group to actually look at the business case on non-potable water and mainstreaming that in everyday development, new development. But I totally agree with you, Nikki, that if you don't fit the pipe, at least the plumbing in now, which has a marginal additional cost, and perhaps Bevan and others in the audience may like to comment on that, retrofitting that in is incredibly expensive. So it is a good opportunity to fit dual plumbing now in new development, even if it has nothing to connect to, in the same way that the Mayor is driving heat networks and saying, well, put in the heat network, even if there isn't a source to connect to, because it's cheaper to do it now than replumb later.
Is that a policy in the new London plan?
You'll have to ask GLA colleagues on that one.
I can see Cassie has put her hand up, who's from the GLA, and who's going to tell us whether or not that is a policy in the new London plan.
Sorry, I just jumped the queue, didn't I? But maybe
that's okay. If you want to, no, we want to try and keep this fairly free-flowing, which is why I've sort of slightly queue jumped Jacob a couple of times there. But we're definitely taking Jacob after you.
So the drainage hierarchy in the London plan promotes water reuse right at the top for new developments. So we are encouraging water reuse. So dual systems and ensuring rainwater harvesting is the first thing that developers should be doing. So basically they should try and deal with all of their surface water on site. So I was going to make just a slightly tangential point, but to the super sewer, the Tideway is dealing with a current problem we have around surface water, but isn't necessarily designed to deal with our future needs in terms of climate change. So we've still got a way to go in terms of managing our surface water, and that's why we've got such a strong policy in the London plan about managing it on site where possible. What we find, because we have a hierarchy approach in the planning policy, is that often developers aren't really going for this water reuse on site, so the dual system approach. So what we want to do is understand why that is. So we've set up, as part of the Mayor's Water Advisory Group that Alex mentioned, we've now got a task and finish group that's focused on myth-busting, breaking down the barriers, working out what's needed to accelerate the adoption of water reuse and making sure those kind of systems are built in right at the start of new developments and then are used. So we think actually there's not that many strong barriers. A lot of it is a bit of that myth-busting. People aren't really sure. They think, oh, will people like the water? Will they not? It's also, we're doing some strong case studies and putting those together. There's a number of great examples across London of working and very efficient water reuse systems in buildings. I think Alex made a good point. Necessarily at an individual property level, this is harder, but certainly when we're looking at the kind of development scale, then water reuse can be a really effective means of managing that water on site.
I'm trying to follow what you said. As far as I've gathered it, it's not a policy in the London plan that new large-scale developments, the strategic developments that come to the Mayor, it's not a policy that they should implement dual water systems. It's something you're thinking about encouraging them to do.
So
is that correct?
It's encouraged. There's a suite of ways through this hierarchy approach I've talked about in how developers can manage their surface water on site. Our first option is around having water reuse systems, but it's not mandatory for dual systems to be installed.
Right.
Okay, so we're going to bring the microphone forward to Jacob now.
Thank you. A lot of the things I was going to talk about were being discussed. So there are two reasons why we're not seeing new buildings reusing water or using rainwater. One is regulatory. It's all very well to encourage, but actually I don't think it works. If you look at Japan, it is compulsory for commercial buildings over a certain size to have rainwater harvesting and water reuse. The second one is on a regulatory basis, there isn't a framework for water reuse. There's no specific stuff over colour of pipe. There's no regulation. In Germany, you have to have a sign outside a building that says it reuses water. There have to be plans. There isn't a framework for that within the UK. There isn't a regulatory basis. In fact, we don't actually have a water strategy for England. Wales has a water strategy. Scotland has a water strategy. There isn't one in England. There are national plans that we're talking about, but there isn't a strategy. And I think all of the things that have been talked about here, when we talk about infrastructure, we've been talking about large infrastructure being provided to us by private water companies. I work for a private water company, so I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but what we're missing is blue-green infrastructure, so making sure that when we are planting all of these hundreds of millions of trees that we're supposed to be planting, or when we're putting in new streetscapes, they should be sponges. So in China, they have something called sponge cities, where rainfall is absorbed. Yeah. That way you wouldn't need a super sewer. When they built Milton Keynes 60 years ago, the runoff from the fields that were there before and the city that was there after was identical. They engineered it so that the runoff was reduced. We could do that in London, but we're not. We could reopen some of the culverted rivers that we have, which would help in terms of heat, because of the specific heat capacity of water. We should be looking at these blue-green solutions all of the time, every single time we do a development. And that needs regulation, but it could also use incentives. So Severn Trent Water in the Midlands, for instance, have a variable infrastructure charge. So when a new building is built, you have an infrastructure charge. You have to pay the water company to connect to water and sewerage. In the Midlands, if you put in a certain level of water efficiency or a certain level of drainage mitigation, you get a discount on that. So it effectively pays you to do the right thing. There are quite simple carrots, and there are also sticks, that we need that would make sure that every piece of development, be it on a small or large scale, contributes to reducing floods and droughts. The irony in London is we're building a massive super sewer because we've got too much water, and there's talk about reservoirs because we've got too little water. If every single new building had rainwater harvesting, if we started to build streetscapes that soaked up water, that enabled aquifers to be recharged, we could solve this. So the two things I would like to see more of is blue-green infrastructure and community involvement. There's an interesting project being run by UCL, Imperial, Oxford and the Met Office called Camilla, which is looking at community engagement within water systems at a small scale. So there are several sites within London where they're looking at how small community gardens contribute to water recharge, to reduction in flooding, things like that. And they are using small pockets of money from different bits rather than relying upon national planning, regional planning, big money from water companies. Not that that's a bad thing, but I think that if we do those very big pieces of infrastructure, we forget about the simple blue-green stuff, and we forget about empowering communities to manage their own water. It's our water. And as Jeanette said, there is a missing link. People do not understand where their water comes from or the fact that it is theirs. And if you can plant more trees and community gardens and put in more green space and say that that's linked to water, you immediately link people back to their environment and they can improve water efficiency and stuff like that. Sorry, I could talk for a while. I'll stop talking.
That's wonderful.
So I just want to pick up one thing that you said, and it has been raised with me many times, which is about the Thames Tideway Tunnel, the super sewer. And several people have made the point to me that if we constructed, and obviously Milton Keynes is a very good example, it's got lots of roundabouts, so you know there's lots of places where surface water runoff isn't happening. And I know that one of the big developments in Barking and Dagenham, because I went to visit it, has got a massive bund that's being constructed, and about 40% of the site is going to be actually to retain surface water runoff, but it's also going to look very natural, and there's going to be lots of planting that uses the water and so on and so forth. But my understanding, notwithstanding, even if we did an awful lot of blue-green infrastructure, lots of bunds, lots of areas that will soak up current and potentially very much more increased sharp rainfall as a result of climate change, even if we did all of that and rainwater harvesting, because there are 8.8 million Londoners who are also going to the toilet, and there is therefore quite a lot more poo than there was when the sewers were built, even if we get all of the water into all of this green-blue area and bunds and all the rest of it, we would still need the Thames Tideway Tunnel. That's my understanding. Is that correct? Or could we, if we deal with the surface water runoff, manage our toilet situation in a different way?
Sorry, do you want my comment or Alex's?
Could we do without the Thames Tideway Tunnel?
My belief is that we can't. I mean, the Thames Tideway Tunnel was as we said, an immediate solution to an immediate problem. And as Cassie identified, it won't manage everything forever. So it still leaves a large need for us to improve the permeability of London, to look at water reuse, etc. So it does not remove the need to do it. And if anything, we need to be able to take more water out of the system to stop it getting into our sewers, to extend the life of the tunnel to deal with climate change and population growth. So the answer is we need both.
Right.
We just need to make sure that we are developing the business case.
Jacob says no. Jacob's shaking his head. He says we don't need both.
Well, Jacob would be happy to have paid the European fines we were probably likely to have got before we had Brexit. I'm sorry for mentioning that B word. Because that's what we were facing. Was very
I might not be able to call you to speak again.
The Thames as a toilet. So I think we need both. We did a lot of studies looking at how long it would take to deliver the amount of permeability and the amount of rain and grey water reuse in order to not need the tunnel, and it would take us an awful long time to do that. So we would have been continuing to pollute the Thames for at least 10, 20, maybe even 25 years, and it was unacceptable.
Okay, how could we have done it without...
Philadelphia looked at building
Sorry?
a tunnel. Philadelphia in the States looked at building a tunnel for exactly the same reasons. They cancelled the tunnel and they used a blue-green infrastructure approach, and it works. There are several other examples. I mean, I think we're probably too far ahead with a tunnel now, but I personally don't think there was enough research done on the potential for blue-green infrastructure. Also, the question is, I don't think Thames Water could have done it, because the things that they would have had to have done were outside their control. I think if it was being done at a national or regional level or by the GLA, then you could do the things that were required to put in the blue-green infrastructure. Thames doesn't have the levers to deliver those blue-green infrastructure things, so the tunnel was probably the best option that Thames had to deliver.
Okay, I suspect it probably would have taken something at government level, because I think the tunnel was subject to a DCO, a development consent order, which comes from government level. Could you pass the microphone to Barry? And actually, Jacob, if you could pass your microphone to Bevan.
And there's a lady up there in the pink scarf.
And I'm going to take everybody from the audience. I think we're going to do that at the end.
Oh.
But we're going to bring in Barry, then I saw Bevan, and then I'm going to bring in Nikki. So I'm deprioritising an assembly member there, so I'll probably be in trouble later. And I might have to ban you, Alex, because you've mentioned both Brexit and eco-bling. The next thing you know, we'll be talking about Donald Trump, and then we'll have... we can play top trumps, if you like, for words that we don't want to have mentioned. Of course, David will be very happy to mention Donald Trump. Barry, go for it.
Barry Todman and Chris, both from the National Pensions Convention, and we were invited here, we understood, on the basis that there were going to be input from younger people, but I now realise that everyone is younger, so we're a bit outvoted. There's a lot of experts here, and I'll be honest, I only knew I was coming here on Friday night, but I've got no expertise in the field other than life experience. And I was particularly interested in the comments that the first speaker made about the problems of the heat wave a couple of years ago, and the problems of ill health, etc. And I note that as a fact. What has not been mentioned at all is the other problems of extreme cold. And people may be surprised to learn that last year the government statistics were that 23,200 additional people died from cold-related illnesses. Now, that in itself is a large number that no one takes any notice of. But even more interesting is that the previous year, which was the coldest winter for a whole number of years, umpteen years, there were over 50,000 people that died that year from cold-related illnesses. So the question is, I know that the analysis is the planet is getting warmer, and as an older person, I welcome that to a selfish way, but I haven't got that long to go. But the reality is that there is the other side of this coin, and we don't talk about the problems of cold and what London needs to do about addressing the people that are dying from the cold. And I just ask the question, why is that?
Well, that's a very interesting area. And can I just say that we have been focusing quite a lot on water and flooding in the discussion so far, but I'm very up for people to introduce drought and heat wave issues as well. And now Barry has introduced the issue of just changing of temperatures and more extreme weather incidents. And I'm going to ask you to pass the microphone to Emma, who's just in the back row there. But before we take Emma, I'm going to take Bevan and then Nikki. So Bevan, and part of that was Barry's question was sort of posed to you.
I'll come to that in a second, but the first point was on a couple of points that were made around developers, construction people. So a lot of my career has been in built environment and construction and house builders. One of my current clients is one of the large house builders.
Can we just wave goodbye to Mulberry? Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Bye, Mulberry.
And I would back up the point around regulation. So when the Code for Sustainable Homes was taken away, what we have now seen, and I know this is generally across the industry, not just with my client, but my client is very good at data. So they look at this. And what I've seen from there is the green solutions to properties gradually being, the percentage installed over all their properties gradually being whittled away. Not in a massive way, but you can start to see the impact of the removal of the code in the definitely last 2 years. The flip side of that is, since the Future Home Standard was announced and the consultation and the desire to push that through building regs over the course of this year, what we have seen is that same company push climate change into one of their key risks. So that's not necessarily because of the work that I've done, but that was very much on their board and their exec team's agenda without me even having to mention it. So the power of regulation does have an impact, even at this stage when the regulation is incomplete. So I would just kind of reiterate that. And there seems to be this fear, especially around house builders. I do work with some local authorities. There seems to be this fear that if we push for something better, that somehow the house builders will disappear in a puff of smoke and go and build somewhere else. They won't. They have land portfolios, they have land banks, they have shareholders, they have housing targets they have to meet. They will build where they need to build because they want to develop relationships with local authority. If they just threw their toys out of the pram and said, we are not building here because you are asking for passive house, then their relationship, their long-term relationship with that construction partner, to use the language, will be destroyed. So house builders who have shareholders, who have pressure from their investors, will not do that. And whenever a client or a local authority says that to me, they then don't show me the resultant evidence of when that has happened. So that's rubbish. So regulation has a power which cannot be replicated through the market. That's that point. In terms of cold...
Actually, Bevan, I think if you also look at their accounts at the end of each year, you can see that house builders aren't doing too badly in terms of the amount of money that they're making. And indeed, some of their chief executives have been hitting the headlines because of their very large bonuses and salaries. So large and eye-watering, I can't even remember how large they are.
They're big numbers, yeah.
Very big numbers. So I do feel you're absolutely right to suggest that they could be doing more.
Yeah, so I can only really speak for my client where this has suddenly become a real issue. And I'm not quite sure where that originated from, but it is leapt onto the list from almost nowhere. Although they do have a good track record of building very high quality and all this type of stuff, which they will put in all their marketing bump. But some are in a better position than others to deal with the physical emergency that's happening as well as the regulatory impact they're going to get. In terms of the cold, there will always be more excess deaths from cold. We do talk about heat, and I think the reason why we talk less about cold excess winter deaths now is because up until very recently there were all the money and all the focus has been on things like Green Deal, eco. It's been on insulating homes, bringing them up to a standard. The UK is a long way behind from where it needs to be, so I'm not acknowledging that. The issue is that what has been missing from that piece is the resultant 360-degree view of how a home or a building should perform. We've got to the stage where we've insulated our homes. We have not ventilated them properly, and therefore we now created an excess summer risk, which has the ability to multiply very quickly in a short space of time. But like I said, cold winter deaths will always be in excess, or they'll be in excess to a point. And that is something that's very important. Unfortunately, our homes are not built to deal with either extreme very well. There is a risk that I think by the late part of this, we're in the 2020s now, late part of this decade or the middle of next decade, something like 76% of London's flats will overheat. And that's just not acceptable for a nation which prides itself on home ownership and house building and stuff like that. So we will gradually, the issue is speed, and I noticed that's one of the points on here. The issue is speed in terms of, and it goes back to my point when I spoke up front, was organisations, when I say organisations, I mean businesses, I mean public organisations, I mean charities, are just not set up to make decisions within a climate context. They don't put a price on carbon. Almost no one puts a price on carbon. They do not know how to value climate risk, which is a real big problem. And I would refer you to the stuff that Lloyd's of London puts out, because they have tried to value climate risk across the world. by city regions. London is the most exposed city in Western Europe, and I think in all of Europe. And they are just, the skill set and the ability and the track record of integrating this stuff into decision making just isn't there. You know, and that is where, to me, a lot of the process is in risk and decision making, and it just isn't there at the minute. And that goes for the system of government being able to make and take decisions in this climate context.
I mean, we've actually got some interesting things that have now been popping up on the Slido.com, which speak to some of the points that Bevan was just making, but also some of the other points that people have been making. Can we build green corridors, but mostly keep the green corridors that we have? Community gardens are being closed for the profit of new developments. Why? And we've also got, how about becoming a model green city? This is the best way to mitigate the effects of climate change long term, and suggest that we should ban cars completely and make public transport free. And those are very interesting comments. And then right there at the bottom, there's a lot of talk about new housing developments, but how can we retrofit our existing housing stock to make it carbon neutral, which speaks, I think is almost a comment really on what you were talking about, Bevan. And that's something that we have been trying to do, but doing it, I think, if I can just sum up, very, very slowly and not very efficiently. And we do need to do a lot more. And there's a lot of other countries around Europe and the rest of the world that have done far more than we have. And there's still yet more that needs to be done. Now, I think Nikki was going to come in, and then Emma's got the microphone, and I can't remember who. There was someone else I was going to pull in as well. But we're going to start with Nikki first.
Chair, I was picking up on still on water. Are we able to going on about water as well as heat, or do you want to divide it up in some way?
No, I think it's going to be fairly free-flowing.
Okay.
Because
Just
people are posting different things on the Slido.
Okay.
Sorry if that makes it jump around a bit for everyone, but I think that will be the best
Just
way.
on the water point, it's always concerned me, and I think many others, that it's about a third, Alex can put me right if it's not, about a third of our water is flushed down the lavatory. And this is drinking water. And I still want to go on about this because you talked so much about, the importance of water. I think it's the new frontier. We just simply don't value it enough, and we have to reuse it. And I just want to know, what can we do at each level? What could the mayor do? What can communities do? What can be done to make sure that we actually don't use drinking water for the things where we don't need to use drinking water? Alex, going to start with you. I mean, what can be done? What needs to be done that we're not doing?
Yes, I think we can all agree that drinking water in the toilet is not really something that we need to do. The only person I've ever met who ever drank from my toilet was when I had a rescue greyhound, if I didn't put the seat down. But I don't think there's anyone else in the room who's likely to be willing to do that. Alex, drinking water down the toilet, why and how can we stop it?
Well, I think Bevan touched on the point that there is no framework to really drive non-potable. So we're starting to see non-potable water standards. So that is the quality that the water needs to be for different uses. So air conditioning, irrigation, and toilet flushing, and washing machines and stuff like that. So it's starting to happen. If the first thing you need to have is an agreed standard of the water for the different uses you want to use it to, it's then about what is the enabling framework that makes that to happen. So colour and coding of pipes, education of customers, the cost effective of it being delivered, etc. I think you're going to say, you would say that coming from a water company, but basically water is so cheap that we don't yet make that decision about how and whether we use it, because it is relatively cheap, accepting that there are a large amount of the population who struggle to pay their water bills. So, we are completely sympathetic and working with those. But for most people, the cost of water isn't a consideration in how they use it. It is significantly cheaper than their mobile phone bill or any other bill, and yet it's possibly the most important thing that they have towards their health. So it's not something that we make an active consideration about. We are working, as I said, with Cassie and the GLA to try and work out what are the processes we need to have to create the self-sustaining enabling of non-potable water reuse. And some of that is about myth-busting, some of it is about having vibrant, dynamic examples that we can hold up to developers and saying, look, it's not the big scary thing. But I suspect the key thing that we're going to retain to is about the risk of the water quality, as in what is the thing that stops someone moving into a house or a flat and reconnecting their grey water, non-potable water use into a drinking water outlet, and then they end up getting sick from that. Unless you have the processes to be able to manage that risk to an acceptable level, so maybe a facilities management process that says actually all work undertaken in a flat or in a community development needs to be signed off by that facilities management in order to be acceptable, or has to be done using their plumbers and engineers. Until we can mitigate that risk to that level, there is always going to be a resistance against it. There's also about who has the legacy of maintaining that system. So they do need to be they do need intensive maintenance. It's not a big issue, and there are companies out there that happily do that. Even for the development immediately opposite has rain and grey water harvesting in it. So we need to work out who is actually going to be responsible for the maintenance and to make sure that actually is done to the standard that assures the quality of the grey water as well. So I'd say those are the two key blockers we face at the moment. The third one is probably then about there is an additional cost to these. If developers don't bear it, who does? Should water companies or others be cross-subsidising it? And what is the business model that enables that?
Can I just one last thing? What about other cities? Are there better models in other cities? I mean, are other cities tackling this?
Yes, other cities are tackling this issue. Jacob identified cities in Japan that do it, and I mean, they value water differently. Japanese water mains are made out of stainless steel because of earthquake risk. They have a more modern network, their leakage is much lower than ours because they intrinsically value water differently. We don't value it as we should do, and therefore the cost of the infrastructure and everything else that goes with it is driven down.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Emma now, because she indicated quite a long time ago and has got the microphone.
Thank you. I work for Public Health England, and I manage the cold weather and heatwave plans for England. So I'm glad you brought up cold, because regardless of climate change, that will remain the biggest cause of excess seasonal mortality in the country. We know that. Many of the issues related to cold and heatwave related mortality are the same, and the challenges are really around the fact that action needs to be taken across the system. So it's very difficult to identify one key thing that can be done to address these issues. But I would say that cold remains one of the biggest priorities because of the huge burden of mortality. Heat for us is also a priority because of the increasing vulnerability that we see. And we have the added issue with heat that around this attitudes and behaviour that Bevan touched on, which is there's a very low awareness about the heat risks that people have, and that it affects their heat in such a significant way, i.e. that it increases mortality. And this is the challenge for us, is really around communicating health impacts when everyone's very happy that the weather is warm. So I think there is some work that could be done around that. And again, the role of the mayor, as you ask, is really, we know that there is a leadership role that can help with climate adaptation. We've done some research into that. And because of this shared responsibility, that leadership role is very crucial. We've seen that at the local level, and it's likely that that relates to the higher level above that as well.
Okay. As you've got the microphone and James is just next to you, I wonder if you could just pass it along to him. And I just wondered if you'd like to comment on the point that Bevan was making about the work that Lloyd's has been doing of trying to factor in this, and Emma was just referring to risk there. We've had several comments about risk. James is from the Association of British Insurers, for those who haven't got the map of who's sitting where. Is that something that the ABI has also been doing modelling work on in terms of looking to the future? Because, you know, we're having discussions here about where does the money come from, but also thinking about the things that we need to do to adapt, make ourselves more resilient, as well as mitigation. Is that something that the ABI has started to look at in terms of insurance premiums, or work to try and work out, you know, which towns in the country are most at risk? Is London more at risk than anywhere else in Europe? That sort of thing.
I work for the Association of British Insurers, not Lloyd's, as you indicated. So I think on the debate as a whole, I'd make a couple of comments. The first would be that I don't think you can necessarily view heat wave as distinct from flooding. And what I mean by that is you need to look at the climate emergency in the round. So if you have extreme heat events where there is no rainfall, when the rain comes, you are much more likely to get very significant flooding events. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that, you've spoken a lot as part of the discussion so far about potable water and reusing water. I think our concern from an insurance perspective is we would fully support all of that, but when the water isn't getting away from buildings, they flood. And that causes really serious damage to people's homes, people's businesses, people's livelihoods, and frankly, and probably most importantly, it destroys people's lives and can upset people's ways of life for very significant periods of time whilst those properties are repaired. So I was struck by the comment earlier about the London plan encouraging developers to think about sustainable drainage systems. I think, as per the comments from other contributors, that we could probably go further than that. And it's not developers that are going to bear the cost of that. It's people who buy houses or people who buy properties. There's no doubt there should be, in my view, no doubt in anyone's mind that builders will pass on the cost to their customer, the home buyer. Can I just make one further point, which is around how much people actually understand the risk that their property faces. I think when most people buy homes or choose where to live, they think about supermarkets, they think about schools, they think about how they can get to work. They very rarely think about the risk, particularly from a flood perspective in an at-risk city like London, that they face. A couple of years ago, we proposed that there should be a traffic light system on property information documents that when people are buying homes, you will not be surprised to learn that did not go down particularly well with estate agents because that is going to turn people off buying a particular property. But people need to know the risk that their property faces, given that it is more likely than not going to be the most expensive thing they ever buy.
Could you pass the microphone forward to Charlie, who's from the Environment Agency, just to remind people, who indicated that she'd just like to come in when you were speaking, James, on a couple of points there.
So is this the appropriate point that we were going to talk about flood risk? Shall we do that now? Yeah, so I think a lot of the points that I was going to say kind of leads on nicely from the ABI there. So in London, we're 4 times as many people are at high risk from surface water flooding than river flooding. And we've talked there about the fact that, it's definitely seeing a changing climate and we're going to have more extreme rainfall and that risk is increasing. And just as the ABI pointed out there, people are not well aware of that, particularly from surface water flooding. So the solution to that is, not an easy one. It's not a hard engineering solution where you can build, for instance, a new Thames barrier. And the note that the GLA that Cathy put out that talked about the things that the mayor's doing actually highlights a lot of the issues that just need to do more. We need to collaborate more. We need to work together with our partners, with Thames Water, the water companies, the mayor, GLA, and obviously also the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee. So there's quite a lot that's going on already, and it's really more of the same. But one of the points I wanted to pick up on there was around funding. So I sit on the London Sustainable Development Commission, actually, with Nikki, and there they have a subgroup that we've been sitting on around green finance and looking at new ways of funding schemes, including SUDs and other green projects across the city. And we'd like to start exploring that more and talking with partners around, you know, how can we be better prepared and bring forward these schemes that aren't going to be funded by government funding. We need those that benefit from them, but also others such as the insurance industry, you know, to invest. And some of the points there that you picked up on around, you know, why are we seeing some changes in the priorities that the developers are giving? You know, actually, that's around some of the investment that they have to make, and that they're now required to take on board resilience and climate change measures. So I think we need to think about that. So there's some work that's happening in Greater Manchester, the Ignition project, where we're working with the combined authority up there and a lot of the other partners, which is looking at how you can bring forward those green finance solutions. So we're hoping that some of those will come out, but maybe that we could start testing some of those schemes that we know aren't going to be funded by government funding or easily by other sources, and see whether we can now look at some green finance solutions to those.
Well, some very interesting. I'm now seeing various hands have been going up. So I've seen Chris, and then I've seen Bevan, and then I've seen Vicky, who all want to come in. I mean, this is a really important area that we've started to touch on, because the government's latest climate projections for London suggest that by the 2050s, that London could see an increase in mean winter rainfall of 15%, which is, you know, really quite an uplift. But at the same time, a decrease in mean summer rainfall of 18%. During that period from 2010 to 2050. Now, once you start to combine the decrease and the increases with what's going on with rising sea levels in the context of global heating, you know, you're talking about something that's going to seriously test our flood defences from the sea, but also it's going to test our surface water runoff systems. It's going to the stresses for buildings that James was referring to, overall infrastructure and green spaces. The Thames barrier protects over 200 million quid's worth of property, and that's just talking about the property aspect. James, of course, was very rightly referring to the impact on people's lives. So it protects, you know, countless millions of Londoners. So, you know, it's not just about whether we're going to see iconic landmarks such as the Houses of Parliament and City Hall sort of surrounded by water. You know, it's also about the impact on people's houses and their lives. And with 15% of London lying in the floodplain of the Thames and its various tributaries, and we sometimes forget the Thames's tributaries. I mean, I think everyone is pretty aware of the Lee Valley because it gets talked about, but in my part of southwest London, we live in the Wandle Valley, and then there's a number of tributaries that all run into the Wandle, which sometimes you only know about them either in road names or in the wards that councillors represent on councils. So, for example, a big tributary close to me is the Graveney that runs into the Wandle. There is a Graveney ward in Wandsworth, there's a Graveney ward in Merton, but the barriers to actually visibly seeing the River Graveney, which is above the ground, in fact, in many areas, but Thames Water have put up sort of, you know, opaque bridges so that it's actually very hard. You practically have to throw yourself over the bridge to be able to sit. All these tributaries are there, these rivers run along the back of people's houses, and along with the Thames, they all form a network of rivers across London. And of course, we're building more and more properties all over London. They're in the Thames floodplain and in this general network of rivers, some of which, of course, are completely culverted and we can't see them at all. So we do actually have a whole situation where flooding, you know, I don't think enough is being done in this area, any more than probably we're doing enough to prepare in terms of adaptation and resilience to drought and heat wave. You know, in Bevan's original remarks introducing us at the beginning. So I think, you know, we've got two big areas here that are very important for us to be developing our thinking much more vigorously. So I'm going to now move to Chris, and then I saw Bevan, and then after that I've seen Sarah and Jeanette. So, sorry, I saw Vicky before that. So Chris, take you first. Oh, and can I also introduce another set of guests who've arrived? This time it's St Helens Primary School from Newham. Do you want to give us a wave? Hello. Chris.
Lovely, thank you, Chair. Yeah, Chris Mason-Ryan from the NPC. Thanks for the invite again. I'm a colleague of Barry's. Some very interesting things obviously have come out. I know, not wanting to detract at all from anything that goes on in London, because I know primarily the discussion we're having centres around London, but all the points that have been made by various people here today doesn't just, go on in London. It's a national problem which we've got, to do with water. My colleague in front from Thames Water emphasised the point of what an important commodity water is. I think we all know that. I don't think anybody here today needs any encouragement or any coercing to accept that fact. Again, it's been made a point about how important water metering is. I don't live in London, albeit I was born and bred in London, did live in London for 40 years. I live in Essex. But water metering in my area, I'm not necessarily saying it's compulsory, but it's certainly very, very well encouraged. And as I understand it, any properties that are bought, when they change hands, if they haven't got a water meter in, then water meters are put in, whether the new owner requires that or not. I believe that is correct. And I assume that is a national setup. Now that in itself obviously is going to make people very, very aware of their water usage, because that's what it's about. One of the things that does concern me, and again, not very much to do in London and everywhere again, is people block paving their front gardens and all this sort of thing, so you're doing away with natural drainage, which affects the water table, of course. Now all that water, whereas it would go into the ground and form the natural water table situation, that's now going into the drainage system, so putting more and more effort onto that. I know it sounds a simplistic small point, but multiply that area across the country is causing a big, big problem. Extensive building work, of course, going on everywhere, and I'm not against that, because we need lots of buildings for people to live in and all that sort of thing. But again, I think a lot more emphasis needs to be put into the utilisation of natural rainwater. Again, it's been mentioned by people here. Why couldn't there be some sort of tank arrangement made on roofs of houses, or particularly in big buildings, and that grey water, as we call it, which is non-consumable, could be used to flush down the toilet, whatever. Again, it sounds simplistic. It's not rocket science to do something like that, I'm sure. And just one last point to follow on what Barry said about the winter deaths thing. One of my colleagues to the right said it was, I think he said it inevitable. I'm not sure if that's the exact words he said, words to that effect, but that concerns me, because when we're talking about climate, we're talking about extreme heat, we're talking about extreme cold. Elderly people that don't live in very well constructed houses, etc., haven't got very good heating systems, etc. Is it acceptable that 20,200 people last year died because of cold related, and in the previous year 50,000 people? I don't know the breakdown of how many of those were in the London area. That was the figure that was issued by the Office of National Statistics. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to actually just pass that over to... Do you want to pass that straight over to Vicky, who I'm now going to take as well? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Vicky Borman from the London Borough of Hillingdon, and the chair of the London Drainage Engineers Group is a nice metaphor, but we represent the lead local flood authorities within the local authorities across London. I think there are a number of points that I'd like to draw on here. First of all, I agree with a number of the points that people have made, is that most of the communities do not know that they are at risk from flooding, particularly surface water. Surface water mapping has only come out in the last few years, and there is a lot of work that certainly we in the local authorities are doing to try and make people more aware of the fact that they are at risk from surface water. Most people assume if they're a long way away from a river, they're okay, and we all know that that's not the case. Although with flood awareness weeks and other things, I think that's quite a passive form of communication. We need to do more to make sure people are aware of the risk, whether that is through when people buy houses or making that clearer, but people don't know what it means when they get an environmental search report back from companies and say they might be at risk. They don't know what that means, and they don't know what to do about it. Now, we've also talked about a lot of potential solutions and things that people can do on their own properties themselves. Things like rainwater harvesting, water butts, all of those sorts of things. And there's some really good examples across the country that Anglian Water are looking at, which can combine rainwater harvesting or rainwater butts and smart sensors to allow water to be discharged in advance of an impending storm, so that it makes sure that there is space to hold the water for a storm, but then it can be reused as well for sort of drought. And I think that does reiterate the point that a number of people have made of the need for a water strategy. We can't deal with drought and flooding in isolation. We need to deal with it as a whole, and the local authorities need support and from the GLA in helping make sure that we have a water strategy by lobbying DEFRA government to make sure that we have a water strategy that brings some of these great water resource plannings, the new Environment Agency National Flood and Coastal Strategy, bringing it together to form a water strategy.
Actually, if you could pass that forward, I'm going to ask Shona, and then actually I'm going to get Charlie to make some remarks around this area of water, because we do seem to, I'm holding the thought about you coming in a minute, Bevan, because Shona, who's at Brunel University, is going to be able to make a contribution now, I think, that would be appropriate around factors that exacerbate flooding, and then and to talk about some of the sort of policy and practice and community engagement solutions. And then I think we'll then hear from Charlie, who's at the Environment Agency, who's going to talk a bit about managing surface water flooding in London. This is an area that I think we now seem to be moving into talking a bit about this, so I think I'd like to bring both of you in at this point. Shona, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. All the comments today, as yourself, Chair, have mentioned that sort of extreme events, especially flooding, really have pushed the idea of flood risk and resilience up political, economic and social agendas, not only here in the UK, but across the world, especially over the last several decades. I mean, just this week, Storm Brendan has been battering the UK, resulting in extreme rainfall, sustained high winds, and then coupled with naturally high tides, resulted in massive disruption to transport systems and schools, and including sort of the flooding of people's houses. Flooding has been recognised in numerous government documents, as well as sort of international conventions. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is one that centres very much on reducing harm from flood events and extreme weather events across the planet. In the UK, government departments, we look at DEFRA's 25-year plan, where reduced harm from flooding was one of the 10 goals that was stated in that piece of legislation, as the Environment Agency have also recognised with the flood and coastal erosion risk management plan that Vicky just mentioned. But obviously this legislation very much sits in a reality where, according to the National Infrastructure Assessment, approximately 5 million houses in England alone are identified as being at risk of flooding, and over 600,000 of those homes have a 1% chance of flooding every year. So this is, and this was published by the National Infrastructure Commission last year. Obviously, flooding is not just a sort of event that happens in the UK. We've seen the worst floods in 7 years around the Indonesian capital of Jakarta, where the death toll has risen to over 66 people now, with about 36,000 people displaced, both in Jakarta and the nearby provinces. In 2017, there were 1,200 people at a minimum died across Bangladesh, India and Nepal, from monsoon-driven flooding, with over 41 million people who were affected. So this is a massive problem around the world, which sort of brings me to my second point, that sort of solving the flood problem is not easy. We've mentioned Japan a couple of times. Japan have invested about £1.5 billion in developing Tokyo's underwater flood cathedral, which is a cathedral that hidden 22 meters under the ground. It's made up of 6.3 kilometers of sort of tunnels and dams and levees that sort of allow the control of water to sort of be captured within the city of Tokyo. You think about 2003, Venice started developing the Mose project, which was sort of retractable floodgates that stretch across the mouths of the 3 inlet lagoons. It's still not operational. Yeah, absolutely. So, just as an aside, right now, even though there was massive flooding in Venice in December, the canals are dry. So, the effect of extreme weather is happening, but it's happening very, very quickly. And this sort of brings me to my third point, that flood management is not just about water. Risk prevention, development of flood defences, flood mitigation, preparation, and adaptation and recovery all play a large role in that building resilience component at different scales. And while legislation and sort of large-scale infrastructure may well provide pieces to ensuring a more proactive rather than reactive state, so too, as you mentioned, individual and community-based actions. However, the policies designed to reduce the impacts of extreme weather are often conceived and possibly usually enacted without the inclusion of people and populations who are most at risk, or at least defined as most vulnerable. And therefore, hand in hand with community action, or the idea that community action should be more prevalent, is the obligation to source and resource and support those community action and local initiatives, including sort of raising awareness within communities and communication of effective ways of reducing that risk. As investment in flood-hit areas and communities sort of promises to rise, as just recently happened, we recognise that we have to recognise that people are very much an expert in their own area, and effective management of flood events before, during and after those events must include the sharing of knowledge and memories within those communities. So communities have a much greater say in what actually works for them. This means not only looking at protecting physical infrastructure, but also understanding the role that social infrastructure and therefore social inequalities play within the resilience debate. And I want to make sure that social inequality piece isn't lost from this conversation.
No, I think that's a really important point. The Joseph Rowntree Trust, who do research in a lot of areas, have produced a website, actually, which anyone can access who wants to. We talk a lot about social justice, and they talk a lot about climate justice. And so the website is interactive, and you can use different layers to layer over where communities are the ones who are both most at risk of flood or heat wave, but also the ones who are potentially going to be the least resilient because they've got the least resources to enable them to meet those challenges. So I would strongly commend anyone who's working with communities to actually go and access it. It's relatively easy to use, although when they launched it, it did crash because too many people tried to all use it at the same time, but it is a very, very useful online tool that they developed. Charlie, we're going to wave goodbye to our friends from St Helens Primary School who are returning to Newham. Thanks for dropping in. I'm sure there was someone from St Helens here yesterday at the Economy Committee. Are you coming tomorrow? We'll see you tomorrow at Housing then. No? Okay. Well, we won't see you tomorrow. Just twice. Wasn't just my imagination then. Charlie.
Without repeating what I've already said, or actually there's been a huge amount of discussion on this already, I'll pick up on the point that you've just made. And something that the Mayor and ourselves are doing is looking at integrated water management strategies, where you look at the full water cycle at a place and include the communities in that discussion about reuse, which is what we've talked about there, and SUDs and other ways to make space for water and slow the water to not get into the sewers. So they're great initiatives that Thames Water ourselves, others are all part of, and there's a couple of pilots, a couple have already taken place and a couple of pilots that are continuing to take place. And I suppose that moves on to the policies that are in the London Plan. So there are some really strong policies in the London Plan, including the urban greening factor, which is another thing that plays into all of this. But we need to see these being realised, and that's the important thing. We need to see the delivery on the ground. And of course that doesn't solve the retrofitting issue and the funding of new schemes, as I mentioned previously. And go back to my other point that I previously made, you know, collaboration with our partners it is really the key to keeping this moving. And we need to, and I saw one of the points here is that it said something around we're all talking about we could, you know, it is about acting now and it is about taking action. So we need to work together and do more. There's a good governance structure, you know, LODEG, you know, lots of other structures within it, the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee. These things exist, but we need to just, you know, now actually deliver more on the ground and keep things moving. I'll leave it there.
Wow, something you said just sparked four people to put their hands up. I've also captured that there are a few people who want to speak from the floor as well. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the four people there after Bevan. So if you give the microphone to Bevan, and I saw you in the order of Alice, Cassie, Sarah. Did you put your hand up as well, Emma? Yeah. Okay, so we'll do Alice, Emma, Cassie, and then Sarah after Bevan. And then I'm going to come to the floor, and I saw the red scarf first, then I saw in the beige top, and then in the front row, and I'll take you in that order as well. So Bevan first, and I made you wait for a long time.
Completely fine. So it's a point that I was going to make, but Shona touched on it in terms of equity and fairness. And so regardless of whether we're talking overheating, cold, flooding, this is an issue that covers all of the areas we're talking about. And I completely agree with everything that you've said from the ABI. And the ABI is one of the organisations that's done the most to try and get its head round climate risk. And this is in response to those physical things that we are seeing and claims and everything like that. There are just a few things that I just want to add on that. Now, as a homeowner myself, we are not the most important people in terms of homes, I would say. Now, Shona may have more up-to-date information than this. This is from 2005, that 60% of those people living within the Thames tidal floodplain are in the most deprived wards. This is from more recent. This is from a survey done by I think an estate agent, that 25% of homes in London are without contents or building insurance. Now, we take those two things together, I would say that, especially when we're talking in terms of the GLA and the mayor's responsibilities, that the people from deprived areas are probably where we should be highlighting and prioritising in terms of any type of environmental risk. The other thing around equity, and this comes back to the cold-related point, and it's a broader point around actually, we talked about cold, heat, flooding, extreme weather. And again, it does talk to my point around we need to be, this is a step change in how we run organisations and businesses. We need to be talking about all those things equally. So cold excess mortality will always be high and it will always exceed summer mortality. However, London can expect to see, nationally, we can expect to see heat-related deaths increase by 257%. So whilst it will still be smaller as a number, it is a growing risk. And as I said, the NHS is already under pressure. It doesn't have that summer lull anymore. That's just not happening. And we've particularly seen that in the last 2 years. The figures from the Adaptation Subcommittee say that climate change will lead to a very small reduction in cold-related deaths. Now, we just need to keep those nuances in mind when we're talking policy and developing strategies, because what's happened for too long is that all of us in the environmental sector, and me as a sustainability professional, we've all been guilty of saying, my issue is more important than that issue over there. This issue is more important than that issue over there. And I think what the role of policymakers, CEOs, executive leaders, is to become more skilled and more accepting of the fact that there are a suite of issues they need to be dealing with, not just one or two. And I think that is one of the big failings of our decision-making, policy-making, business decisions as an economy and internationally when it comes to dealing with climate risk. We tend to devolve it to the person who sits in the broom cupboard because they're the specialist. Ideally, I should be out of a job. Organisations should not be hiring me to come in and tell them what to do. their chief exec, their finance director, their exec leaders should all be fully knowledgeable of these issues and how it impacts on their business or their operations or their delivery of their services. And unfortunately, we're not at that stage yet. And so that's my call in terms of equity, in terms of any of the issues we're talking about today.
I mean, I think you make some very interesting points there, particularly the one about the way in which we, and it sort of answers, or is almost a riposte really to some of the things that Charlie and others have been saying about we need to work more together. And I think that is always one of the problems with decision-making processes in local government, regional government, central government, or in big organisations that cover the country, and I can see nodding already from some of the people behind you, that decisions are made in isolation and they're not integrated together across the different subject areas. So in fact, the very first contribution that was made after the initial comments from Bevan and Alex was from Sarah. We were then faced with a discussion where we're talking about, is it a great idea to build a railway that may or may not be a good idea in and of itself, but is it a great idea to build it in such a place that it's destroying an aquifer that is full of water, that has been beautifully filtered, that is very drinkable? And that is exactly why the way that we do our decision making, where everything is divided up, causes us these huge problems. One of the things, we're Assembly members, so we, as the London Assembly, hold the Mayor and his team to account. And so we have our criticisms of the Mayor, and we also tease out what we feel the Mayor has failed to do from the original manifesto. One of the things I think the Mayor has got right, and his teams of staff have got right, is their attempt, and I'm not saying it's fully successful necessarily, but their attempt to sweep together in a much more thorough way the London Plan, the Environment Strategy, the London Transport Strategy, and they all do cross-reference each other in a much more thorough way. Now, I'm not saying any of them are perfect documents, and round the table here we could all pull out things, and we regularly do. We're Assembly members, it's our job. But there has been an attempt made to bring together those documents so that planning, environment and transport and housing, actually also I should mention, that those documents speak to each other and do cross-reference each other. And actually we need to be doing that much more thoroughly. Sorry, that was a very long comment, and I think the first person that I saw was Alice, who's from the GLA Fire and Resilience team.
Thank you. Yeah, as I said, I'm part of the GLA Fire and Resilience team. We're hoping to add a resilience strategy to that packet of GLA strategies very soon.
Coming soon in a cinema near us.
Oh, yes. I'd like to pick up on Bevan's point, and actually a few points that have been made. One of the challenges that we have seen coming up time and time again, and I think is really important, is that when it comes to resilience building, you can only look at things in a systemic way. So there is no one solution at one end that will be fine without a solution at the completely opposite end. And I guess the example I would give is we have historically looked at risk and resilience building from a national point of view, from a risk assessment that forcibly prioritises different risks, which means that when we come to dealing with things going very wrong in whatever context, we don't necessarily link that to how we make things better in future. I guess the one area where maybe nationally we have been quite good at, and this is maybe not entirely in context, but follow the route if that helps, is to look at, we all would get on the tube, and if we saw an unattended bag, we would immediately do something about that, because we are so ingrained to dealing with terrorism, what that means for us individually and how that affects us collectively as a whole, and what we could potentially do to prevent it. Now, yes, there are different approaches to this, but I would suggest that what we haven't yet made the link with is the personal identification with resource scarcity, especially to water and especially to climate. Now, one of the things I think is really important is that, although we've touched on heat here, it's something that's so alien to us, I would suggest at the moment, that we haven't really grasped a way of managing it and of dealing with it, because the idea of having 2 months of Barcelona-like weather, yes, it might be nice in some ways, but actually the potential upheaval for daily lives and the fact that our infrastructure doesn't necessarily work for it means that we need to look at infrastructure solutions, but actually we also need to look at personal solutions and develop a narrative around how we individually would start looking at completely different climatic conditions. And one of the things, I mean, we certainly want to build in solutions like Paris have done for people and for individuals so they can make their daily journeys to work or find ways of dealing with weather when it's extremely hot in London. But I think that looking at the problem as a whole will help us find more useful solutions. Because we may not link the fact that a lack of water, that won't necessarily stop you having a really long shower, because you don't associate what you pay for water with the fact that you're using a lot of it. So it's again valuing that scarcity, which I think we still need to find in an individual narrative to be able to move towards.
Thank you. Do you want to just pass it straight along to Emma, who's next? And then after you finish, if you can pass it to Cassie, and then we're going to come to Sarah. I've now seen Jeanette, and I've also seen Christina, and then we're going to come to people in the audience, and then that is going to be the end, because we need to finish by 12:15, I think. So, Emma.
I originally put my hand up to talk about inequalities, health inequalities, so I was glad that Shona mentioned it. And I was going to go back to the mortality for excess winter and summer and mention that a large number of those deaths are indeed preventable. So that is the point to make. And that's the aspiration of the effort. So with regards to Sarah's point then, because I think the inequalities thing has been covered in terms of its importance and the impacts are inequitably distributed as are the exposures, and so any activities need to recognise that. And relating that back to Sarah's point is that those interventions are best set within the local context on the basis of those specific vulnerabilities and the community resilience that's already there, and working from that as a basis. And really, by doing that, you're much more likely to find a solution that also taps into the co-benefits, blue-green infrastructure that tackles flooding, surface water flooding, also heat, urban heat island, as well as the mental health dividends from that. So I was just going to mention that element from a health perspective.
Do you want to just pass that on? I mean, as well as doing our work in our committees, we're also privileged as Assembly members to do individual reports. And I did a report into the concept of biodiversity in housing developments, which included introducing the green space factor as something that has now become the urban greening factor in the London plan, and also talked about net biodiversity gain. So whenever we're doing anything to our city, we need to make sure that we include nature and that there should be more of it when we finished than we started with. And I think that is a really important principle that is also in the London plan as well, which hopefully will be signed off in its entirety very shortly. Because, you know, if we are going to have any weather that's like Barcelona for any length of time every year, we are not ready as a city for dealing with that. It's not just about how nice it is. You know, we don't have the shading, we don't have the porticos that bring shade where you walk down a street. We don't have the biodiversity that they have in Barcelona on every roundabout that provides an antidote to a certain degree to the urban heat island effect, as well as acting as somewhere that will soak up excess water as it arrives. So we're in a very different place from other cities that are much more used to dealing with heat. We're not able to deal with it, and I think that's a huge concern. However, we're going to bring in Cassie now.
Thanks. And I mean, with the GLA, we're trying to do something about that. As you'll know, we're part of the C40s network, which brings together megacities from across the world trying to tackle climate change and particularly share ideas and solutions. There is one network called the Cool Cities Network, and we're working closely with them, firstly developing some of these kind of areas of refuge that Alice talked about during hot weather periods, but also learning from their further ideas. I was going to just touch on some of the strategies, Chair, which you've actually kindly mentioned for me, but one being the Mayor's integrated environment strategy, which is the first time that all of the environment strategies across London have been brought together. And I think that some of the issues that have been brought today have been dealt with well within that strategy, such as the approach to water. We've talked about water in all of these different aspects today. We've talked about water efficiency, about flooding, about new resources, and the strategy really tries to bring together policies and objectives that find common solutions to those issues. So a couple of nice examples of how we're doing that is one, through the Mayor's green infrastructure policies. We are installing and planting green infrastructure that does provide shade, that does slow down rainwater from getting into the sewer, that holds rainwater underneath the green infrastructure, that deculverts rivers to allow them to have natural flood management. And all of our green infrastructure policies have that right at the heart of them, as well as achieving the other multiple benefits that green infrastructure brings. Charlie mentioned the integrated water management strategies. I think they're a really good demonstration of a kind of water framework that we talked about. We focus these on areas of key growth areas in London. So the Isle of Dogs is an area that we're considering at the moment that faces interesting challenges in terms of water. Large portions of the year has too much, large portions of the year it has too little, and somewhere in between the rest of the time. And so we're working then in partnership with Tower Hamlets, Thames Water, the Environment Agency, to look at things like large-scale water reuse that we can do on the system, how we can have the most water-efficient developments, how we can be, discharging excess surface water to the Thames, for example. All of these different options to ensure that any development happening in those areas is treating water as the valuable resource that it should be. So how we can reuse it where we can, or how we can use as little as possible, but still have high-functioning development. And then last thing I was going to mention, because I realised I'm taking a lot of time, was on the London Plan policies. So you mentioned before that you thought it was just an encouragement. The encouragement I mentioned was around dual pipes in buildings. We have a requirement for properties and developments to meet greenfield runoff rates, so deal with their water on site. And that can be either through water reuse, green sustainable drainage, which is a next preference, rainwater harvesting, and and other solutions that are available in that location. But also we have strong flood resilience policies. The flood risk is considered for every development in a planning application, and relevant property level flood resilience measures are put in place. Could be anything such as no bedrooms on the ground floor. If that's going to be an area of high flood risk, then obviously you don't want any bedrooms on a ground floor of a development. So that is considered. And we also have a water efficiency policy that goes beyond building regulations, recognising that London and the South East are a water-stressed area, and that we should be building developments that really limit the amount of water that they're using. We would like to see a slightly easier way of this being done, so we have sort of lobbied the government to say that a water label or a fixtures and fittings approach should be taken, a bit like you have for energy, where you have a energy-efficient washing machine. How water efficient is your washing machine? That would make some compliance with building regulations easier. So those are just a few of the ways that I think this integrated approach to water is being taken. I agree with many of the comments that's not being seen at a national level as well, but I think in London we're on the path to really trying to link those things together.
Sarah. Thank you, Cassie.
I'm sorry, I couldn't disagree more. I'm from West London. We have the most water-rich environment. We have the aquifers, we have lakes, we have rivers. We have the largest tributary of the Thames, the River Colne, which is the border of Western London. We are being ignored. There is a sponge in terms of blue-green infrastructure. It is being ruined. 28,000 trees are being felled. In the middle of the valley is an SMI, site of metropolitan importance for London. We cannot get any support from the Mayor's office or for anyone in biodiversity. We cannot get any support from London Borough of Hillingdon, and no one stands up for biodiversity. It is being swept away. It is being destroyed. It is almost like a microcosm of the macrocosm of climate change in the whole world. Money is being spent to drive climate change here in London. And who is acting? The people that are acting are being prosecuted. The people that are acting are being arrested. Yesterday I left a site. There was young men had gone up the trees at 8 o'clock in the morning because it was in the SMI, it was in the nature reserve. HS2 were coming in to fell those trees. There was no accountability for the biodiversity. There is no species plan. There is nothing in place. The climbers couldn't get them down because the wind was too high. They were up all night and they're still up. That is an emergency.
Sarah, thank you for that powerful rebuttal to what you heard. And this is what these gatherings are all about, because we can just all fall into this sort of malaise or miasma that some minor actions are great actions. Thank you for that and for bringing that to us today. Can I just say, I just want to make a couple of quick points. Jacob, thank you for your contribution. And you talked about the Camilla project. And I believe that I've got one in my constituency, North East London, Woodbury Down. But if you have any information about where they are, could you send them through to our officers? Because certainly, as a constituency member, I would welcome and continually, I'm always reaching out to people who are doing this sort of work. So thank you for that. And you also talked about community engagement. And it just seems to me that we absolutely need, and from what Sarah said, we need this huge dialogue with Londoners about these issues. And just want to flag up, we're heading towards an election. So there is that opportunity there for everybody to actually get involved and to be putting their case to these prospective candidates who want to be the next mayor of London. Barry and Chris, you brought to us the whole issue and about the excess deaths, cold-related deaths. And I've just looked it up, and it equates to something like, what was it I found? 417 deaths a day, or 17 deaths an hour. And these relating to 75 people aged 75 years and over. I would say to you, and totally agree with you, if this was at the other end of the age spectrum, if this was related to class or those who had the power, then this wouldn't be happening now. So I do hope that the NPC will be looking to bring this up again in the time that we've got coming in front of us, because this has to stop. And it then links with what Emma was saying about the mayor has a duty, a health inequality remit. So he cannot look at one thing in isolation to the others. So the fact that Londoners are dying because of cold, and the fact that if we were to enter into a situation where we introduced water meters, adding that choice to those Londoners who already have to make the choice between food and fuel, if they then had to make a choice between water, then many of my constituencies would, if they're not criminals already, would find themselves in that situation where they might have to start stealing to be able to live. It's that critical. I also have the other end of the spectrum where I share constituents who live the life as they do in Richmond, who water meter is not going to affect them at all, you know. And so let's just, when we talk about water meters, let's just be clear here about the social impact that this is going to have to huge numbers of Londoners. And it was just to, and I'm looking at you, Alex, you just appear to me to be just too wedded to this, like, water meter approach. So I would just caution you in terms of the impact on Londoners.
Christina, I don't know whether, have you got where are the microphones? Christina wanted to come in. And then, Aoife, are you ready with the microphone for, okay, the contributions from the floor?
Sorry, I'll keep it brief in the interest of time, but I think I wanted to pick up on the equity point. So a lot of what we've been talking about here this morning, particularly with the focus on water, has potentially had less impact on the network. But I think when we talk about that social equity point and the extremes of temperature, having things like your public services and public transport networks running is something that's really key to the functioning of the city and people being able to participate. So I think we've all recognised that London's already feeling the effects of hotter summers and wetter winters, and as the Strategic Transport Authority, we obviously need to be alive to that, and if we are not, and we're not responsive, operational reliability is going to suffer, it will become more costly and complex, and we're not going to be able to offer such a good service. So we have detailed response and readiness plans for all kinds of extreme weather. But I think particularly in terms of what we've been talking about today, heat and flooding are probably particularly important to us. And so I won't go through the detail of all the things we do on the network in times of heat or to mitigate against flooding. But I think it's important to recognise some of the things we're doing. So the dual impacts for us are really on the network, but then on passenger comfort, and they're sort of two different sides of it, really. So there's a lot we do on the network in terms of monitoring and increasing maintenance and making sure that the system's able to run. In terms of passenger comfort, we talked about the city not being prepared for this kind of thing. We do have some very old infrastructure, and trying to retrofit that for the extremes is very difficult. But some of the ways we're able to modernise our materials with tracks that are less likely to buckle, and things like in our bus design standards now, white roofs and tinted windows and windows that open and aircon and cooling in the underground where we can. So of course we are doing all of those things, but just a kind of anecdotal observation almost is talking about people and people being used to things and how that helps kind of that personal response. We were looking at the instance of people being ill on a train, and you would imagine that in those extreme heats of the summer you'd see a kind of really steep rise in that. And actually we don't see that kind of hand-in-hand correlation, and that's partly because people are wearing less clothes, they are carrying water, they are better prepared for it, whereas in winter we have the thing where people are got big coats and hats and scarves on, and they're going from the inside to the outside. So it's a very kind of colloquial example, but where people are better prepared, where they know what's happening and kind of conscious of steps that need to be taken, you can see that actually has a kind of impact on how things work and how it runs.
Thank you. Now I can see we have our queue of people who've joined EFA. Can I just remind you that you're going to be webcast, so do speak clearly into the microphone. It might be helpful if you just say your name, anything relevant if you're from a particular organisation, or just, if not, which part of London you're from, if that's okay. So, Aoife, over to you now.
My name's Nicola Baird and I'm from Islington. I noticed we haven't yet heard the feedback and learning from the massive Finsbury Park flood, which was actually caused by the water company. But I wasn't affected by that. But my own street in Finsbury Park is really quite short. This winter, 6 trees have been cut down. The robin that used to live there, the blackbirds, they aren't there anymore, and goodness knows how hot and non-shady it will be this summer. The reason, it turns out the insurance companies order these trees to be cut down because of the dry summer, the subsidence that happens. It's subsidence claims on Victorian houses, which obviously London is full of. How can communities, all the London Assembly, prevent this?
So cutting down of trees. Or indeed actually cutting down of mature trees.
Yeah, Islington has a cut down plant owner policy.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, my name is Malini Mehra, and along with Charlie and Nikki, I'm on the Mayor's Sustainable Development Commission. I'm also an advisor to the head of the United Nations body on disaster risk reduction. We came out with a major report last year called the Global
We can't
Assessment
hear
Report.
properly.
Too fast.
Is that better?
A bit fast, and please...
Very close.
Okay, sorry, trying to talk very fast because of time constraints. So, my name is Malini Mehra. I'm an advisor to the head of the United Nations on disaster risk reduction. We came out with a very important message in our latest report, which was that risk and risk reduction and resilience are not just issues for politicians, planners, insurance and the like, but most importantly for everyone, especially communities. I'd like just to briefly mention work that we're doing as part of the London Climate Action Week initiative with schools communities. These are communities that are not only student focused but bring together student leaders as well as staff and parents. Last year for LCOR 2019, we put together a unique package, a resource package of information for school children on what climate change means for them as Londoners. It was an explanation, certainly in terms of climate change and global climate change, but it was focused on what they could do as young people living in London. Two small examples from that. We did a program in Riverside School, which is very close to the Thames Barrier. And in order to get the young people to understand surface water flooding, as Charlie was speaking about, and sustainable urban drainage systems, we asked them to have an intergenerational dialogue in their own families about the paving over of front gardens and back gardens, and those kind of simple measures to try and communicate better concepts such as SUDS. We also talked about what heating means in the context of children who are undergoing fasting during Ramadan. As we know, June and July are the hottest months, and schools are utterly unprepared for the fact that they have migrant children communities, young Londoners who are brought here, who are born here, who actually fast at school. So we need policies which are addressing those integrated issues around water management, yes, but also health in the schooling context. I would welcome your support as the Environment Committee and the Mayor's leadership in convening school leaders to talk specifically about how young people can be involved in taking action on climate change, particularly given the surge of interest that we've seen through the climate strikes and others of young people interested in these issues. Tomorrow's voters. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for speaking so rapidly to get all of your points in.
Yes, hi, I'm Rosalind Redhead. At the moment, I'm living on net carbon zero, 1 tonne of carbon per year, to see what that's like. So I've sort of gone through the portal, and I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at things. One, mobilisation. It's at scale and at speed, and we're just not getting that focus here. This has to be done very, very quickly at scale, and retrofitting at scale. I mean, this is an enormous job, and I just feel that there is not the leadership and focus to really passionately go for this. It just seems very sort of low-key, and this is like an unprecedented risk. This is something we've never been before, and it is escalating, but, you know, really by the month, and I really think that we need to G this up a bit. Second, Denmark has an average of 80 litres per day. Londoners in the UK have 140 litres. Now, I'm guessing the Danes still flush the toilet. What are they doing right? Number 3, SUDS. I went to a meeting up the top of the building here a few years ago, and I said, well, come on, you know, strategically, how much tarmac do we need to remove in London for flood mitigation? And the answer was too politically sensitive. I mean, this is just ridiculous, for God's sake. We need to know the quantity of tarmac we need to remove in London. You know, we've got to get straight to the root of these problems. Number 4, insulation. I mean, you know, we need to retrofit. I don't care about building new stuff. We've got to retrofit millions of homes. Paris saw 44 degrees, last year, sorry. You know, we are going to get that, and we are so unprepared. People are going to die in their homes, and if we don't provide cooling in say, libraries or community spaces that people can actually go to if their homes can't be insulated in time, you know, we're going to have dead people, you know, boiled in their own homes. We haven't even touched on food security, food growing. We are going to need to grow more food here. How is the water going to, you know, go with that? And the final thing, which I think is really important, and, you know, I'm quite surprised this hasn't been mentioned, is the connection between heat and air pollution. Heating increases air pollution. We know in the summer now that our hospitals are being flooded by young children, the combination of pollen, heat, and air pollution. Now, we already know 9,000 people per year are dying, you know, prematurely dying in London. Why have we not mentioned those deaths of heat and air pollution combined, and what that's going to do to our city? You know, I really think that needed to be far higher up the risks than it was mentioned. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a really good summary there. And I think we have 2 more speakers to come. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dido Barclay, and I've been working on the river, the pollution.
You're going to need to speak much more closely to the microphone if you want us to hear you.
Okay. My name is Dido Barclay. I'm from the Thames Blue-Green Economy, and have been working on the river, the pollution, the tidal Thames Tideway, and water for the last 25 years. My great-great-grandfather worked with Bazalgette, and I have the maps of the sewers underneath, so I know quite a lot. I would like to suggest that I feel we're pussyfooting around rather like the last speaker, and I think we're tinkering with the edges. What we've now got is an emergency, and it needs radical steps. And what I like to suggest, and it's been pointed out by a number of people, that we have a water commissioner who deals with the overall management of a blue-green plan for London and the whole of the Thames Basin, because the pollution that's coming down the Thames is not Thames Water. Alex is incorrect in saying it's a toilet. It's now the cleanest river, one of the cleanest rivers in the world, and it has met the European and Environment Agency standards. It is because the pollution is coming down from upstream. And since the Lee Tunnel has been built and the sewage treatment works have been upgraded, that is why the river is now considered one of the cleanest rivers in the world. It could be stopped. The carbon footprint is absolutely enormous, and it's going to cost us £100 billion. So what we need to be doing is that the water companies that are concerned with London need to be municipalised. We need to have some green bonds to deal with the funding, because the funding, I've worked with the SUDS groups around the boroughs, and they say, look, we're doing SUDS, but we'd love to do blue greening and integrated water management, but there's no money, there's no management. So it comes down to, I went to the APPG on water the other day for the national policy framework on infrastructure, and it was absolutely clear there that everything was based on hard asset, carbon intensive projects. We don't need to bring water down from the north. We don't need any more big reservoirs or tunnels. What we need to do, we might need the odd one. We need to actually put all our money and energy, and this needs to come from the government. The GLA can only do so much. I stopped working on the London plan when I realised the London plan could only do so much. It needs to come from the top. It needs to be radical. We need a water commissioner, and we really need to do something. I think that's all. Yes, one thing is the population where the Thames Tunnel is, it has not gone up. It is actually down. Where Bazalgette and my great-great-grandfather built those sewers, the population has gone down. The Tideway Tunnel is actually going to be dealing with other parts of London.
Thank you very much for that. That's another comprehensive set of comments there. Can I just make one point? I know that a number of people... Sorry, there's someone behind you, I think, who's going to speak as well. Thank you very much.
We'll save £30 billion if we did integrated water management, and we're not doing that under the government.
Okay, so the point that I just wanted to make is a number of people who've referred, and it also includes on the Slido screen as well, to things like having something at national level, having a water commissioner at a national level, the building of HS2, which is subject to a development consent order, comes from national government. Heathrow expansion, development consent order, national government. We are the London Assembly. We can comment on issues that relate to London, and we are able to have some influence on decisions that are taken by the Mayor. However, our ability to control the decisions about the way that government approaches things at national level is much more limited, and is probably equalised across this room in terms of all of us having that. And I just want people to be clear that there are things that we have got some influence over, or we can put influence towards, and there are others where our role is much less, which is why we've been tending to focus on London today, because we are the London Assembly. So can we just take the last comments from... Two last comments. But if you could be brief, that would be very welcome.
My name is Florence Colley-Raja. My specialisation isn't specifically what we've discussed today. I work in sustainability and AI focused on the fashion industry, because people don't realise that it's aviation and shipping combined, in fact, and it's perhaps a third behind the dairy and meat industry and its impact on our planet. I wanted to ask a question that we know much more about in the fashion industry, which is microplastic. London, research shows that London actually has microplastic in its rainfall and at the worst rates. And it's been found in groundwater, aquifers, and drinking water. Specifically, it's been, I guess, noted that it's not at dangerous levels, but how much research is being done around this element and perhaps a growing risk around microplastic. I think the other element I wanted to note is in terms of framework. it's often, people will stay in their silos. And I respect your comments earlier about the London Assembly not having access to perhaps influence national policy. But there needs to be a connecting of dots. I have actually worked with national government. I've run for UK Parliament, European Parliament. I worked in councils. I worked in investment banking. And there's no cross-sector, cross-department dialogues which need to happen because this is a national crisis. It's a global crisis. So I think that answer sadly is not good enough that those conversations are not happening. Then the last point I wanted to note is about education. We will continue having the same discussions when we're not actually bringing climate change and sustainability in terms of a focus of innovation around it into the curriculum and the education system. Because I know, being educated here in the UK at top private schools, I was never taught anything in terms of understanding the nature and the world around us despite studying all of these things. And I went on to, as I say, work in investment banking in Parliament, and I didn't get it until further down the line. So we're lacking an understanding and a connection to our environment in terms of what we are being educated. Despite being top bankers, lawyers, we don't understand the environment we live in. And then I guess the last point is in terms of framework. There is a framework that exists, but no one is even implementing it in terms of industry or within departments anywhere. Very few places have actual sustainability officers in specific departments. There's very little dialogue about it. There's the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, which has barely been implemented in terms of policy within banks or any organization. Often you have one sustainability officer to cover the whole of a whole investment bank. That's not good enough anymore, and we need to see companies being forced to hire sustainability officers, as that gentleman said, to put him out of business because a CEO would know what it's about. Because quite honestly, I'll say to you, my 6-year-old son at this given moment knows more than the average CEO or MP about sustainability and climate action.
Thank you very much. And also really appreciate that you fitted in so much into such a short period of time. Thank you. And finally...
I'm Ben from Extinction Rebellion London, and I live in Barnet, which thankfully is not low down when it comes to flooding, but we are a coastal city. Coastal cities around hundreds of billions of people may have to, be displaced. So my question is, for residents of Fulham, Vauxhall, Beckton, neighbourhoods like the schools that have been visiting Stratford, will they have to give up their homes? The science says that we might have to move London uphill, said Professor David King, who's been pushing him.
I mean,
he said that.
I think we've been touching on these issues in a fairly rounded way today. And I'd like to thank everybody who's made a contribution. I'd particularly like to thank the people who've made the effort to come along today and have made a contribution from the floor of the chamber. Also, all of our guests who've come along. I'm not going to name you all individually. You've all made key contributions to this meeting, and thank you very much to the Assembly members who've also put in their questions as well. And I'm just sorry that Caroline Russell wasn't able to be with us today, and I'm sure she's absolutely will be champing at the bit to be chairing the next meeting in February, where we're going to be looking at the climate emergency in relation to buildings. I just need to do a couple of close-up items of business. Could I ask the committee to note the report which we received and also the subsequent discussion that we've just held, and if you would be prepared to delegate authority to the Chair of the Environment Committee in consultation with Party Group League members to agree any outputs arising from today's session. We also have our work programme, which is at pages 73 to 76 in your agenda. If you're happy to note that, I can hear that Jeanette is already noting it. The date of the next meeting, which for anyone who's here or listening on the webcast, is the 13th of February and will be at 10 o'clock in the chamber, and is the follow-on from this meeting, and will be about climate emergency and buildings specifically. And there's no other business that I consider to be urgent, so I'm going to do the bang the gavel so that the webcast is ended. Thank you very much.